Kia ora tātou. No mai, haere mai. We're about to start this next keynote session. I'd like to start with a very quick aroha mai. Apologies from me for the coughing fit in the middle of Jessie's COVID announcements. Not staged at all. Post-viral cough, I can assure you, and the virus wasn't COVID. So, and also just before introducing Uma, I wanted to draw your attention to something. So my name's Regina Scavens, I'm the chair of the DevNet Steering Committee, and on the Friday of this conference there is going to be a really cool format of the Great Debate happening in this room just after lunch, and the topic for the Great Debate this year is the pandemic has been good for development in the Pacific. Okay, and we have about half of the places filled on the two teams, and I would love to hear from a couple of other people in the audience if they would be willing to join the debate on that topic, on either the affirmative or the negative team. I think there's some really important issues to be debated there, and especially in a conference which is like the minister's speech drew our attention to, is looking a lot at localisation and development. So please approach me, otherwise you may find I'm tapping on somebody's shoulder. So look forward to that on Friday. Now it's my real pleasure to do a big no mai haere mai to Professor Uma Kothari, who is our keynote speaker for this afternoon. She is the Professor of Migration and Post-Colonial Studies at the Global Development Institute at Manchester University, and she's currently a visiting researcher at Massey University. I first heard of Uma's work not long after I got really excited about people such as Robert Chambers talking about participatory development and participatory rural appraisal and stuff like that. It was really cool. He was out here talking at a conference and ran a workshop, and many of us were getting really, really motivated. And then this book came out, this book by Cook and Kothari called Participation: The New Tyranny. And so I knew we had a great critical scholar in our midst and lots to learn from Uma. Apart from the fact that she has many accolades go with and great achievements across her career. Most recently, she's been a VC fellow in geography at the University of Melbourne. But a few other things about her, after a conversation I had with somebody who's quite close to her. I said, what are the important things for people to know about our honoured guest speaker this afternoon? And he said, well, she's a Londoner, she's an enthusiast for life, she's up for an adventure, and I can attest to that. She fell out into Te Awa Tupua, the Wanganui River last weekend, went on a canoeing adventure. She is interested in a wealth of things, loves to travel, and has multitudes of friends all around the place. And I think a lot of that speaks to the fact that she's very generous as an academic. She is very collegial. She would love a conversation with any of you at any of the break times at this conference. So she's not one of those highfalutin sorts that is too important to stay after her keynote address. And she's a wonderful professional and lovely friend and colleague to have with us here. So can you please give a warm welcome to Professor Uma Kothari.
Thank you so much. That's lovely. I'm not sure which lands I'm from, but I'm a visitor on these lands, and over the last month I've witnessed and been afforded a great welcome and incredible kindness. So thank you for that. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation to present here, and to Regina Scavens and colleagues for providing such an intellectually stimulating and convivial environment at Massey University, where I'm visiting for a couple of months. I took up an academic post in development studies at a university in the north of England. It is 1992. I arrived, the only and first female academic, the only and first person of colour. But very soon, within a few weeks, it became evident through language, through conversation, through dress, through approach, through behaviour, that some of my new colleagues were former British colonial administrators. Because when the winds of change brought about by political independence in former colonies had blown those employed by the British Colonial Office out of Africa, out of Asia, many had to return to the UK and find second careers. They had to find new employment. And amongst those embarking on second careers were a group of individuals who thought that their experiences as colonialists made them incredibly well suited to take up employment in the newly emerging and rapidly expanding international development industry in the UK in the 1960s and the 1970s, where they were, until they retired, involved in teaching development studies, devising development policies, advising multilateral, bilateral development agencies. And one of them said to me, well, I thought at the time, when Kenya gained independence, I thought, right, if I can no longer work out here in Kenya as a colonial officer, the next best thing is to be working for the development of Kenya in the development field. After all, it's the same thing. And I thought, wow, I had been arguing for quite a while that development did not begin with Truman's speech in 1947, that there is a much longer legacy. I would be a millionaire if I had £1 for every student who started their essay. Development began with Truman's speech in 1947. It has a much longer legacy, and here before me were a group of people who embodied the coloniality of development, who reflected a form of colonialism that survived the demise of empires, and most significantly, who were influential in shaping the ideas and what I call the rhythms of development that linger today. So I want to offer some reflections on where and how these dominant rhythms of development persist, and also identify opportunities to forge new ones. And specifically, I want to look at the circulation of ideas, of objects, and of stories, and use that to reveal what might be inhibiting processes of decolonizing development, but also what can support our endeavors. And all of this in an attempt to address one of the questions posed by the conference organizers: is development decolonizing? But a caveat at the start. Decoloniality is necessarily interpreted and practiced variously because people and places experience different histories. And I certainly don't want to deny or to conceal that diversity. But I must acknowledge that my own narrative is situated. It can only come from a particular geography, history, and place. And I welcome the opportunity clearly to hear of other people's perspectives. So I speak about mainstream development in and of what I call the West. Now, I'm not sure whether my presenting here represents a rhythm, a strong, regular, repeated pattern, or recurring sequence of events or processes, but I was invited to give a keynote here in Auckland at the DevNet conference in 2012, 10 years ago. I think the organizers might have forgotten that because they could have invited somebody else instead of me. At that time, I talked about popular representations of development, constructions of a common humanity. And in some ways, of course, development thinking has progressed since then. But in many ways, it continues to avoid addressing very deep, structural, rooted problems, often assuming that context, historical, geographical, social, cultural, are irrelevant. Instead, we always tend to be responding to this or that crisis. We've got a plethora of conferences on rethinking development, or the future of development, or towards new perspectives of development, as if all we need to do is just tinker a little bit with our approaches, with our methods, with our theories, and we will find the right answer and all will be well. All the while, as Lata Narayanaswamy says, we have a system continually reinventing itself by claiming that it's the only and best source for solutions to the problems it caused. But when no environmental crisis, no health crisis, no war or conflict, no extent of poverty, no economic crisis is deemed alarming enough to fundamentally transform the structures and the systems that create and maintain inequalities, we can't keep rethinking. We can't keep reformulating. We really do need to break the cycle, interrupt the rhythm, play different tunes, redirect the flow of ideas. And of course, this isn't to deny that there's some very important creative and progressive work already underway, and I witness that. in the session before lunch, in a very powerful session, very important session, that recognizes that we must start by unsettling. Comfortableness is not an option here. And I'm reminded of what Edward Said wrote, that there's a choice facing the individual scholar or intellectual, whether to put intellect at the service of power or at the service of criticism, communities, and moral sense. Well, decoloniality, or approaches to decoloniality, is in the service of criticism, communities, moral sense, and ultimately of justice. As Indigenous scholar and artist Katarina Tiawa says, where does the crisis end if not with justice? So I focus on three considerations for decolonizing development. First, what are some of the obstacles towards decoloniality? Second, while some advances have been made, I draw on Tuck and Yang's decolonization is not a metaphor to show how these are insufficient unless we deal with the materiality of decoloniality. And third, briefly, I want to talk about the power of stories and storytelling. So first, the obstacles to decoloniality and the endless circulation of abbreviated histories and quite bad ideas. And there are four challenges that we appear to be so reticent to engage with, and when we do, are so unwilling to listen to what they tell us. Now, of course, this isn't a blanket consideration, and as I say, there's a lot of very interesting, important, creative, and progressive work already underway. So the first, mainstream development discourse continues to conceal its history. It continues to be ahistorical. It sounds very obvious, but history does matter. And decoloniality requires us to interrogate the colonial past to understand the present-day legacies and manifestations. But why is mainstream development discourse so ahistorical? Well, the first is that in development teaching and lots of textbooks, we do start with 1947. We call it post-war development and Truman's speech, which completely obscures that colonial legacy. Secondly, we want to distance the international aid industry from colonialism to avoid tarnishing what's presented as a humanitarian project with what is now acknowledged as the exploitation of the colonial era. And third, the limited historical analysis in much orthodox development is partly because it's so future-oriented, with its imperative to achieve development goals and targets, most evident and exemplified in the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. But we know that we have to consider history. It's impossible to gain an understanding of the present without an understanding of the past. We know that. How and why inequalities and violences that we see today have emerged, how and why are they being perpetuated? And it's only when we can better understand that history can we truly begin to decolonize knowledge, theories, research, practice, and policies. In Time's Place, Jean Tronto argues that conceiving of the past as irrelevant, except insofar as it shapes our present and future options, has devastating consequences for our concerns for justice. Forgetting history leaves no room for remedying past injustices or moving towards an accountable responsibility. So we need to remain vigilant to those historical relations which remain hidden, unrecognized, and have mutated. The second obstacle, and fundamentally, is that we're never really asked what decolonizing means for those of us who identify with or are involved in development in its manifold manifestations. The process of decoloniality clearly may require many of us currently engaged in development to vacate the space, to be silent, to listen to others, formerly colonized, indigenous, and marginalized. The Sustainable Development Goals talks of partnerships, for example, framing them in this sort of, I think, quite cozy coming together terms. But this isn't about adding in indigenous voices, global South partners. It means not doing things as much as doing things. It's about moving out of the way, stepping aside, pausing, being silent. But we keep lingering, which, as Parvati Raghuram says, continues to assert some kind of moral authority. I don't mean that some of us have no role then, just a different one, and I'll come to that. The other reason why I think the obstacle to decolonizing development and that might be preventing us from doing this is the perpetual cycle of the co-optation of radical ideas into the development mainstream that has for so long characterized development theory, discourse, and practice. So I'm wary about some of these calls to decolonize, and my ambivalence stems from a disquiet about how decolonizing development is being promoted and understood, and importantly, by whom. It's being invoked by different people, applying varied and multiple meanings to it and with diverse motives. So the concern here amongst critical development thinkers is that development discourse and practice has a very long history of appropriating, sanitizing, and purifying progressive ideas and approaches. Historically, concepts and theories, however remotely radical they might be, don't remain radical for long. Instead, they're co-opted into the mainstream, being appropriated by international development agencies, governments, practitioners. So, for example, in the 1980s, feminist theories transmuted into the less critical gender and development. In the 1990s, participatory development became the acceptable face of a more radical consciousness raising. And in the 2000s, the powerful theorizing and activism of anti-racism became incorporated into the language of culture and development. It's important then that we remain vigilant, that decolonization doesn't become just a more acceptable, palatable version of a radical anti-colonialism. And of course, I should be pleased, but instead I'm really fearful that everyone is now talking about decolonization. Even those least likely to ever care about it, they can invoke the term. So is this shift leading to a watering down an acceptable face, a less radical idea, a palatable term that can be uttered by all and everyone? So even if decolonizing imperatives were to be substantively deployed to inform development, given tendencies to co-opt critical discourses, it's likely that that might too lose its radical edge. And the fourth obstacle to decoloniality, perhaps more provocatively, if development discourse and practice today is in part founded on a colonial legacy, and my colleagues at my university in the north of England were a manifestation of that, if development discourse is in part founded on that colonial legacy, manifested, for example, in what it means to progress, or how distinctions and hierarchies are forged between people and societies, places and cultures, then is development itself, as we know it, untenable after decolonization? Given its colonial legacy, what and where is development after decolonization? Can we still use the term development? And will it mean the same once we've decolonized? And are we ready to accept that? So these are some of the obstacles to decolonizing development. But what I want to now turn to is to consider what we're currently, or how we're currently approaching decoloniality in development. So calls to decolonize are currently on many agendas. Within academia, there's much focus on decolonizing the university, decolonizing the curriculum, decolonizing knowledge. And for some of us, these extend to discussions on how colonizing structures can be unraveled. But of course, as Walter Mignolo and others remind us, these calls for decoloniality aren't new at all. They've been evident for centuries, ever since the resistance and struggles of South Americans against European invasion, indigenous peoples' resistance to colonialism. There's always been resistance to forms of dispossession, refusals to be incorporated into programs that do harm, and protests against the exercise and the concentration of power. All these alternative possibilities are already underway. And calls to decolonize knowledge and research are not new. For example, Frantz Fanon, Ngugi, Chinua Achebe, Jamaica Kincaid, Toni Morrison, all of them addressed through fiction and other media through the ways the possibilities of decolonizing. So moves towards decoloniality have never gone away. There's a circularity to these ideas, and some have come to the fore again. And recently, there's been some really important work on decoloniality that very usefully reveals how colonial structures of power, knowledge, and subjectivity are inextricably linked to the contemporary world. Attempts are made now to untangle the production of knowledge from that's been produced primarily through a Eurocentric position. These approaches recognize that forms of knowledge about economy, democracy, development, education, culture, and so on, through which the world is apprehended, explained, and modeled for the future, is deeply rooted in post-Enlightenment Euro-American thinking. These approaches engage with a range of critical and radical scholarship, including critical black scholarship, indigenous and feminist theorizing. And they attempt to move away from a provincializing of Western claims, instead encouraging rethinking from Latin America, from sub-Saharan Africa, from the marginalized and indigenous places and people. Importantly, in these decolonial approaches, colonialism is seen as a fundamental problem and decolonization as a project. Now, taking colonialism as a fundamental problem rather than a secondary issue or a problem of pure historical significance means that colonialism has deeply shaped key practices, ideas, and structures in our modern world. It means that modern ideals, such as progress and development, modern institutions, such as the nation state, modern conceptions of knowledge and subjectivity, have come into being with colonialism as a background, as an implication. So decoloniality clearly signals a profound turn in theory and philosophy, as it goes directly against the norm of conceiving the colonial subject as a problem. Now, all these understandings, of course, are hugely important. They recognize that simply labeling something as colonial doesn't make it go away. Sometimes it just comes back and even stronger. So there have been important shifts in thinking, but they remain constrained, as Essen et al. Write. Some argue that decolonization itself may not be the most appropriate word, because like colonization, it came from somewhere else. Perhaps it could be replaced with an ethic of restoration. So one way to break free of this problem, to change the rhythm of the perpetual circulation of ideas and their co-optation, is to make our interventions count, to focus more on the material rather than solely the symbolic, to which I now want to turn. It's 1986. On a trip with my partner around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, we came across a castle. A modest one, as you can see, by Scottish standards. The gateposts were broken and completely covered in moss. Much of the glass of the conservatory, which you can only just about see here, was shattered. The land surrounding it was overgrown. It looked derelict. We walked round to the front. The imposing entrance door was ajar. It was too tempting. I couldn't resist. Now, I do need to clarify, I don't go into really breaking into other people's homes. It's not a habit of mine at all, but I felt compelled. Something was luring me in. It felt strangely as though I was entitled to be there. We entered, and we couldn't believe what we saw. From the huge entrance hall, room after room was replete with objects, jewelry, and sculptures in display cabinets and on every surface. The walls crammed with paintings and hangings, every floor space covered with pieces of antique furniture. There was something eerily familiar about these things, and on closer inspection, because I did move around this building, I realized that what made them so striking and recognizable, that they were all from the colonies. They were mainly from India, but elsewhere too. Even though at that moment I was the interloper, I was the intruder, I felt deeply indignant. These things were stolen. They belonged to my people. I learned that the castle, for more than 500 years, belonged to a family of colonialists. Indeed, one room was completely wallpapered with Victorian colonial cartoons. And I read recently that the current heir and owner of the same family from 500 years had lauded insensitively, and I quote, "There's plenty of stuff in our house," not castle, you note. "History is on the walls. It's written in the house." And I wanted to ask, but what and whose history? Many years later, I recalled this incident as I read and took inspiration from Tuck and Yang's groundbreaking 2012 work, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. They argue that decolonization is a question of territory, of the giving back of stolen land, objects, and resources. And as such, it has real material effects. They remind us that decolonization can't easily be grafted onto pre-existing discourses and frameworks, even if they are critical, even if they are anti-racist, even if they are justice frameworks. They argue that decolonization is far too often subsumed into the directives of civil and human rights-based social justice projects without recognizing that decolonization wants something different than those forms of justice. As important as their goals may be, they write, social justice, critical methodologies, or approaches that decenter colonial perspectives have objectives that may be incommensurable because they can be entangled in resettlement and reoccupation. They write that the easy adoption of decolonizing discourse by educational advocacy and scholarship, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools, decolonize our methods, or decolonize student thinking, turns decolonization, they argue, into a metaphor. Seeing decolonization as a metaphor makes possible then a whole set of evasions and a reproduction of colonialist relations. Decolonizing development then is not about the abstract. It's beyond rhetoric. It's not simply an academic exercise, a theory. It's beyond the symbolic, beyond interrogating our individual positionality and forms of knowledge production. It's about practice, and fundamentally, it's material. It entails giving back appropriated resources and the undoing of economic structures that reproduce those colonial inequalities. So while scholars have long shown how capitalist economic systems dehumanize populations and legitimize devaluation and dispossession based on racist framings, there remains a reluctance to perform the critical material work of redistribution and reparation that Tuck and Yang so powerfully articulate. Specifically, they argue that decolonization is not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies, but must bring about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. So recently, there have been global campaigns and decolonial public protests, and I'm sure that you're all aware of, and they've been very important in certain parts of the world. But there are two areas that often remain largely outside of the remit of development, and that scholars aren't fully engaging with: the repatriation of stolen objects and reparations as redistributive justice. These are rarely considered in certain fields or subfields of development. They're not seen to reduce poverty or inequality, and therefore they're not considered to be urgent, but they are urgent. They're hugely powerful in addressing inequalities and injustices. They can profoundly shift ongoing coloniality and have real material effects. What is justice, after all, than righting wrongs? I don't have time to focus on both these approaches, but I want to look at the rhythms of coloniality and the possibilities of decolonizing through objects, and specifically the repatriation of what museums call artifacts. Calls to decolonize have importantly questioned the role of museums and the histories and cultures of collections. One expression of this has recently gained renewed momentum, and that's the repatriation of objects stolen and appropriated through colonialism. The return of the cultural property to their country of origin, or former owners or their heirs, is significant. It's important. It shows respect for the dead, for cultural beliefs, and for the hurt that's been caused. Repatriation is about restoring dignity and making right the wrongs of the past. It's about apologizing. When in 2019, Maori remains were handed over to the Museum of New Zealand, the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford said, "We can't undo history, but we can be part of the process of healing." And in July this year, Germany and Nigeria signed an agreement whereby hundreds of objects looted and removed by the British during colonialism and later auctioned off to Germany would be returned. And a representative of the German Green Party at the time said, "We have reason to celebrate. It was wrong to take the Benin bronzes, and it was wrong to keep them. This is the beginning to right the wrongs." And in 2019, Manchester Museum, which is part of the University of Manchester, where I'm based, in partnership with the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, established the Return of Cultural Heritage Project. And they began returning sacred objects to Indigenous communities in Australia. And this was based on an appreciation that these items were taken by force under processes of colonization, and they continue to have damaging effects. And the curator of the museum acknowledged that the Western processes and protocols established to catalogue, preserve, and analyze objects and specimens in isolation from traditional owners, countries of origin, and diaspora communities continues to inflict loss, trauma, and exclusion. At the repatriation ceremony, one of the traditional owners said, "We share a dark history, but it's moments like this when we can come together as one, united by our desire to do better, to be better, and to right the wrongs of the past, that we start to heal spiritual hurts and the intergenerational trauma that still exists today and which is evidenced in many of the presentations, or some of the presentations that I heard this morning. Repatriation of objects, he said, fosters truth-telling about our nation's history." So through these processes of repatriation, in the words of Ross Gibson, the past pushes unfinished into the present. Objects matter. They embody stories, histories, and social relations. Things have effective emotional and political power. This shifts the emphasis away from what objects symbolize to how they create inequalities and perpetuate violences, but also, hopefully, through the repatriation of objects, how they can begin to right past wrongs. And the return of stolen objects provides, of course, just one example of the potential to develop progressive, transformational decoloniality. But today, we can't just sit back and consider these injustices to have been created by others in the distant past. Development interventions continue to lead to the appropriation of material resources, land, assets, natural resources, rivers, water, extractive industries, deforestation, through, for example, the linking of aid with trade, or what David Harvey calls accumulation by dispossession, or what Saskia Sassen refers to as the brutality of expulsions through displacements, evictions, and eradications, all in the name of development. Decolonization is not a metaphor. Giving back land, objects, and resources is hugely significant. Additionally, as a representative of native title Aboriginal corporations said, locked deep within these objects is also our histories and our stories. And as Lauren Tynan reminds us, stories are held in the land and in memory. And it's to this uniqueness and power of stories and storytelling that I want to now briefly turn. It's 2020. While the UK was in lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic, I spent the long, hot summer afternoons with my 94-year-old mum, making sure to maintain social distance by sitting on the landing outside the front door of her second-floor flat while she sat in her hallway. Despite the wider atmosphere of fear and instability, these days were magical. Our deep connection strengthened as she shared memories and recited poetry. I relished that exquisite, forgotten childhood pleasure of being told stories and of being read to aloud. And she is a wonderful storyteller, and I'm captivated as her stories conjure up multiple historical and effective associations and connections between people and places, and stimulate our capacity to imagine ourselves in different landscapes. And more than that, she's acutely attuned to the presence of her listener. And so when she tells you a story, you feel that it's being recounted especially and exclusively for you. So in this intimate yet distant space, the past ran alongside the present and the stories began to unfold. And part of that story is of my mother as a young woman in India, an anti-colonial nationalist, fists raised, marching in protest for independence of India. And listening to her now, an elderly woman unable to walk without the aid of a stick, the image of her protesting with purpose and passion reminds us both of her once youthful energies and of a wider politics that should never be forgotten. I'm wary of recounting a personal story in an academic tradition that for so long has emphasized and prioritized critical distance. But for a while now, I've been reading a lot of critical work and stories that reflect on the centrality of storying and storytelling, not only to uncover, value, and communicate the intimately involved, the unfinished, the embodied, but also possibly as the only way to begin help us unfold the new radical progressive insights, to bring the whispers that Ben Okri refers to into sharper focus. Said argued that the unrepresented stories of others are essential to identify how those formerly colonized confront their entanglement in processes through which they have become defined and confined. And Ross Gibson says, while our stories can start and stay in privacy, we can also use them to pronounce to and on the larger world. That was a 1 upside down, so I'm taking it as a 2. No, I will finish very soon. Stories can save lives, and storytelling is always a political act. You might be familiar with Behrooth Bokhani's No Friend But the Mountains, writing from Manos prison, a memoir written from a detention center in 2019. It was composed over his 6-year detention, thumbed one text at a time on a smuggled phone. He wove together a community of witnesses around the world. Stories also have rhythms. Some are progressive, while others can incite injustice and violence. As Ben Okri reminds us, anything that affects our perception of the world usually comes in the form of a story, but that means we always have to be aware of the stories that we imbibe. Moana Jackson writes, the fact that colonization necessarily involves the brutal taking of indigenous people's lands and lives has also been reframed and justified in stories. Indigenous people have spoken back against such stories, but they remain the dominant narrative. Yet perhaps through processes of decoloniality, these stories are in the process of coming apart, perhaps to be replaced by new and better ones. So stories have rhythms, and there are all kinds of other rhythms that are now being increasingly acknowledged within development and have the power to affect change. They can alert us in a way to injustices, music, dance, poetry, literature, art, creative rhythms that are now being recognized as powerful tools and avenues. And we can see this in, for example, work on songwriting as an example of creative practice, also beautifully articulated in the writings of Pacific feminist development geographer Yvonne Underhill-Sem on the rhythm of the ocean and seas. All these creative rhythms are urging us to move to a different beat. And in conclusion, it's the problem of the forgetful past and the unobserved future that challenges the potential for decolonizing development. But, as Pat Noxolo writes, or suggests, decoloniality can provide a loud and radical challenge, one that is linked more directly to protest and direct confrontation with existing practice. I want to end with a quote from the Martinican poet, author, and politician Aimé Césaire. In Return to My Native Land, he wrote, "And no race holds a monopoly of beauty, of intelligence, of strength. There is a place for all at the rendezvous of victory." While this is often quoted, I feel that his sentiments are especially salient now and are worth repeating. He reminds us that our encounters and interactions with each other are not invitations to focus on deficiencies and absences, but are opportunities for enrichment, urging us to imagine the rendezvous of victory as a much more capacious, kind, generous place. It may be rather grand for me to say this, but I hope that in coming together at this time, we're contributing in our own small ways to creating the kind of space invoked by Aimé Césaire. Clearly what this requires is a politics of restoration and hope, but then that's a whole other story. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Uma. Hugely stimulating, provocative, fascinating journey she's taken us on, and we literally, unfortunately, only have 4 minutes for questions. But no, I didn't want to stop any of that. It was fantastic. So, is it a mic that you have? Okay, right. So, if you put your hand up, I don't think there's any that have come through virtually yet. So if you put your hand up, you might be one of the 2 lucky people that get to ask a question at the same time, and then not at the same time, but one after the other, then Uma will attempt to answer those. And just remember that in the breaks, she's very happy to talk more about these issues and across the conference.
I am, and it doesn't have to be questions, comments, your own take, your own perspective. I really welcome listening to other people.
Okay, so we've got Louisa. Is there anyone else who will want to ask a question after Louisa? Because then we'll make sure the mic goes to you.
Kia ora koutou. Uma, that was more than fascinating. It was inspiring. And I want to thank you. I guess for me then, at the heart of it is what's the role of Indigenous peoples themselves?
Thank you. That's really, I think, a very important question and resonates well with one of the questions that Sam asked in a previous session is about what is the role of a white academic, is that I think we're all trying to find where we fit and where our roles are. And
development, because if you look at the development agencies and the makeup of those agencies.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know whether I'm really the person and well situated to say what I feel that Indigenous people in those spaces should do. I feel that the session before and the presentations that we heard were examples, I think, of people invoking, adapting, developing different ways of recounting stories, trauma of the past, intergenerational conflict and manifestations. So I think your question is really well taken. I don't know whether I am the right person to respond to what I feel that Indigenous people...
Well, the other aspect of it is structural competency.
Oh, well, yes, okay, so for me, that's a very long-standing debate and discussion around, in my youth, I worked at anti-apartheid, Chilean solidarity, and there was always a debate amongst those of us of the left who were activists about whether you work within the structure to change it or whether you work from out with. And I think those are decisions that people are taking all the time, that we're all taking. I'm an academic in an institution in England where my colleagues were former colonial administrators, and that's where I worked. I made certain kinds of choices. And I think that has a much longer history about working within those structures and working out with them. And I think we all position ourselves quite differently and responsively and actively within those. Thank you.
If it's a quick one, we can do a very quick question. If that's cool, sorry, we will need the mic to come up and so that our virtual participants can hear you as well, and those at the Lalala campus of USP. So if we keep it short, that would be fantastic. Thanks so much.
It's not really a question. I'm just wanting to let you know how encouraging your speech has been, and love there's room for every one at a rendezvous of victory, because you are the second I've seen here of, say, Indigenous people who are trying to make their understanding and make their voices heard, and it seems to me like we're all on the same level, or where we know a lot about our own Indigenous situations, and we want to pass it on to that objective there. Well, I call it an objective, but it's a beautiful one.
Thank you. That's a lovely way to end, I think. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That is a lovely way to bring this to a close. And could everybody please, again, show their thanks to The next sessions are starting right now, and there's some awesome ones to choose from, so I hope you know which room you're going to, and fantastic.
Thank you.